stewardship of the land and the folks who occupy the units on the land. Also talk about, specific to this group, information on CLT and shared equity planning, programming, that basically approaches that you can implement to utilize those lots that were talked about earlier. And then talks about successfully establishing a CLT, including some examples around the state. So we all probably recognize that there's a need for affordable housing, but the question that I often ask is, do you understand what opportunities lie in creating affordable housing opportunities that are going to be affordable for long-term or even conceptually permanently? I say conceptually because I don't plan on living 99 years. I'm 45, I plan on living till I'm 40 when a Super Bowl 100 occurs, and then after that, I'll be that's my mission in life. I've had other missions before, but that's the one that I'm on right now. We know in the last few years that price appreciation of homes has kind of been surprising and maybe out of control in some places, especially here in Florida. And the diminishing amounts of public assistance relative to that appreciation, the difficulties in selecting sites that are going to be able to be developed for a reasonable cost is shrinking because we're continuing to sprawl and build, and the land obviously is a commodity the way it is treated in this country. So all that being said, to make homes affordable, there is typically going to be a greater need for subsidy or some sort of charity, for lack of a better term, to make the units affordable so that folks can afford to have a place to live, whether it be renting or for home ownership. So having a stewardship component as part of an affordable housing program to ensure the funds that are provided continue to be utilized for the purpose that they originally had, which is creating affordability. And with this concept of long-term affordability, the idea is that the funding, subsidy retention anyway, the funding is going to stay with the unit in one form or fashion for the benefit of not just that initial home buyer, but everyone subsequent too. So we're really using this model to create a foundation of units that will build out a community stock of affordable housing, because we know we are on our recycling method of assisting a family. They buy a house and then they sell the house, but it's at market rate. And so now another family comes in and they're going to need some assistance in that same way, but likely much more because prices have appreciated. And so that's what this slide is talking about. And the real question, as I'm alluding, is if you have, and let's just say, maybe you have enough affordable housing right now in 2025. I can venture to guess you probably don't. And you probably have a great need for affordable rental that is going to be affordable for folks who have income that's less than 50% of AMI. Probably a greater figure with the lower you get, the closer to 30% of AMI. And then there's often a chasm of affordability between folks paying for rent and then being able to leap to buying a home. And that filling that gap is what people often talk about, a subsidy gap and affordability gap. And that's where us folks in affordable housing live. So shared equity provisions incorporate through restricted deeds, long-term leases such as 99-year ground leases, incorporate the mechanisms necessary to keep units affordable for more than one household to buy them, or more than one household to rent them. Things, most importantly, like limiting the price of resale through some form of formula. That doesn't mean that we are negating the opportunity to build wealth. It means that the wealth being built is not just for that one individual household, but for the community in general, because the community land trust is stewarding the funds that were used to create the unit or to support the purchase of the unit initially or there is there's an ongoing stewardship that's occurring. And also, I'll talk about on the next slide, is this separation, the next slide, the separation, the shared ownership concept, where the land is being owned by the organization, the CLT, and the improvements are owned by the individual buyer, which of course you take the land out of the equation. Oftentimes, especially in higher cost areas, that is a significant support to affordability. But I digress to talk about this illustration of shared equity and retention of the subsidy. So subsidy retention is a very, very important concept that is utilized by community land trust. It doesn't mean that traditional subsidy can't work. It means that it isn't as efficient to provide funding to a family. That money is recirculated into a fund when they decide to sell, for example, and then you have to identify a new household that would be eligible for it to basically do the same thing all over again. The retention model allows for efficiency to occur because you're already establishing that those funds are going to be moved from one family to the next through one of those legal instruments that I mentioned on that same unit to build that stock of housing. So this is how it works. I'm going to let you look at that for a second because.
How often is this being done? The math makes sense. It looks.
How often?
Yeah, meaning the shared equity CLT on the left, is that a common practice?
More and more every day.
Okay.
It's becoming more and more common every day, Michael. I will say that 2 years ago, maybe 3, there were about 20 some odd CLTs, most of them being established at that time. And now, you fast forward, because of what's happened since the pandemic and the shut-in and all that, and price appreciation, it has driven more folks to this concept of shared equity and permanent affordability because what has happened in the market and the lack of options that people have to have a place to live that's affordable. We always talk about people living within their means, but now we have a system where it forces a lot of folks to live outside their means in order to have a place to live. So imagine in 2018, or even imagine today, a home being purchased, and then in 7 years, which is the average time frame for someone to own a home in the United States, these are what the numbers look like. At purchase is at the top where it says 2018. The market value of the home is $250,000, and the buyer who wants to buy this home can afford $200,000, so they need $50,000 of subsidy to make the deal work. So at our original purchase, you see how this is laid out, and the first big point that you need to recognize is that with the purchase assistance on the right, that $50,000 is going to be repaid, and it's not going to reduce the original purchase price to make it affordable. It's only making it affordable because there's another little piece of money, $50,000 being dropped in, so they can afford it. So they're buying it for $250,000. The shared equity model, that base price is at $250,000, but it's being reduced by the $50,000. So the price that they're actually paying is $200,000.
So it's not recaptured.
It will not be recaptured. That's correct. So the traditional model is the recapture model of traditional subsidy. And so the resale model, if we're using terms from the HUD home program, that's what you're referring to, sir.
It seems like the pendulum's kind of gone both ways. So originally, SHIP dollars were used where they were intended to be granted, and that was probably back in the 80s and 90s. And in the 90s, you saw the shift to where they wanted to recapture, which is where we are now, and it looks like we're swinging back to where it'll be just
call it a grant because they're all functional grants. They're all typically deferred loans. But your point is clear that there has been a shift between, and more often than not, historically, the SHIP communities use the recapture model. The question is, are they, one, allowed by Florida Housing Finance Corporation to truly grant the funds and never see the funds again? And with subsidy retention, we're not talking necessarily about a grant. We're talking about the subsidy being retained and stewarded. No matter how long the legal instrument's term is, the CLT, through its stewardship, is obligated to ensure that those funds will continue to reduce the base price to make sure the home is affordable based on that subsidy that's provided. But the point that you're making, and I hear you clearly, is SHIP communities, especially when SHIP was lean, the state wasn't really providing a lot of SHIP funds. That's when I was a SHIP administrator, so I remember it vividly, at least this most recent time, about 5 years ago, where you get a couple $100,000, and really you were running your program on the income that was coming back in when people were selling their homes. And so that is why I think most communities have followed the recapture model. However, because of this making logical sense to a lot of folks and a lot of SHIP administrators, there has been a movement that has followed the establishment of CLTs in certain communities where SHIP administrators recognize the opportunity to do something that's going to last, and so they're converting their policy to allow for the subsidy retention model to be followed. So thank you for that comment. So of course with shared equity, because as I mentioned, there is a resale price restriction, and in this case, in this example, the 25% of the appreciation is going to be shared with the homeowner, the seller. Now, yes, that's not sharing the full appreciation as you can see on the right-hand side, but that also means that this home is not going to be lost to the speculative market, because on the right, well, the price has appreciated substantially. And let's remember, these are not unrealistic numbers. I didn't just make them up. This is from a community in Florida, okay? So this 80% increase, yes, this family gets a absolute windfall to see essentially a very little to no investment, and their opportunity, their wealth has now grown by $200,000 over 7 years. That is absolutely awesome. But what we're not talking about is that home will never be affordable ever again, unless you add $150,000 of subsidy, as you see in bold at the bottom, to make it equitably affordable compared to the shared equity unit on the left.
Is that the only downside of the left? I don't
What's
really
that?
see it as a downside, but
What's that?
The homeowner can't reap the benefits of the full appreciation value. I mean, is that the only downside? Even though I don't see it as a downside really, but.
Possibly, you could consider it a downside, but as we'll discuss more and more, you'll recognize that there's other opportunities to build wealth as a owner of a CLT. For example, saving money, having an opportunity to save money. You're still paying down principal on your loan. You're still able to benefit from property tax exemptions like homestead and all that sort of stuff. And the big reason you can save money is because your mortgage is a lot less, right? But I'll continue because I've gotten well ahead of myself. So, in essence, let's define a CLT. First and foremost, it is a nonprofit organization. Let's not overcomplicate what a CLT is. It is a nonprofit organization. What makes it a CLT is the community involvement. Many times, the board who governs the nonprofit organization has community representatives, also sometimes representatives of the group of folks, the members who rent from the CLT, whether they're renting land or they're renting a unit. And there's also opportunities for members of the community in general to participate in the nonprofit as members, and they also can be represented on the board. So this is traditionally a community-led organization that is a nonprofit that, through shared equity provisions that we just established, promotes permanent affordability and utilizes the concept of shared ownership, as I mentioned, separating title from land and retaining ownership of that land from the improvements. And administers the ground lease, typically a 99-year ground lease, to the end user. In this particular case, we're focusing, based on the infographic, we're talking specifically about home ownership here. The 99-year ground lease gives the lessee the right to use the land as if they owned it. So it's not going to be the way that you may think, where it's a 1 or a 2-year lease. This is a long-term lease. It's renewable and has many provisions that will support that homeowner remaining in the home and providing the stability of home ownership, while at the same time providing opportunities for wealth building and generational wealth, because the lease and the home can be transferred to heirs. So the infographic really just displays what I just mentioned: separating title from land, the ground lease being a critical document that includes the resale formula we just talked about. It mentions the amount of subsidy that is to be retained to benefit buyer to buyer, so that the home stays affordable. And the concept is, when it's affordable to the first, the design is for it to be affordable to all the next.
Now, did you say that it can transfer to heirs?
Yes.
Now, does the heirs have to be of a certain income?
It depends on the category, and it depends on how the CLT as the organization devises their ground lease. There is flexibility, but we follow the model ground lease that's used nationally, and the way that it's written, certain individuals, people who live in the household, people who are of the closest familial relationship, do not have to income qualify. But those things can be tweaked to a more liberal or conservative approach, depending upon the CLT's intent and desire. So this particular slide is to help you understand who is the CLT for home ownership model. Who is this for? And this is for folks that I talked about earlier who want to own a home, but they can't afford to, so they're just stuck renting, right? We like to call this illustration the equity ladder, where the CLT is creating more steps or more rungs on the ladder, more opportunity, so that folks who are renting but want to buy a home, see the stability of home ownership, be able to build equity, can do that through this CLT model. So more often than not, it's easier to conceptualize the benefits, as I think Michael's really starting to get to already, the benefits of CLT home ownership when you compare it to renting. If you start to compare it to fee simple home ownership, you recognize there's a lot of benefits that are pretty significant with fee simple home ownership. And so if you can afford to buy fee simple, that means land and home, that's what you should do. So you don't have to have resale restrictions, because we're not trying to take away the American dream through the CLT model. We're trying to create an opportunity for folks who all they do is can dream. Did your hand raise because you had a question, sir?
Yes, I did.
I'm happy to entertain.
I didn't know if you were entertaining questions or not. But the question I had was, when, say, if they got into that house, is it reported to the credit bureaus? Because the problem we're having now is a lot of people that are paying an absorbent amount of rent. It's like you're paying the same for a house, but it's not being reported to the credit bureau, so you're not getting actual value for it. And this is one of the things that I wanted to try to address with somebody, but I don't know who to talk to about that. It might have to be legislature or something like that to put into law, but does the people that occupy get reported on the credit bureau so they can get credit for having to pay that?
This is a great question, I love your hat.
Thank you.
If we are talking about CLT for home ownership, you can treat that home ownership extremely similar to home ownership for fee simple. You
Okay.
take out a mortgage,
Right.
they're definitely slapping that on your
Yeah,
credit report because they don't
exactly.
want their money, right? So, yes, to answer your question very simply.
Great, thank you.
Yes, sir. But you bring up a great point as far as, in the previous slide, we were talking about a monthly payment of approximately $1,800 or less, and comparable rent, as I mentioned to you, this is a real example of an unnamed community, in West Central Florida. The comparable rent goes for, and this is just fair market rent, what the federal government establishes year to year, somewhere between $2,200 and $3,700. So if you think about wealth building for an opportunity to save, you're talking about potentially something very substantial, monthly, and of course, if you annualize it. So getting into what really makes a CLT unique, makes it special, and sets it apart from any other affordable housing program is this concept of stewardship. This concept of your community helping you be an occupant of a home, an occupant of a rental, a home ownership opportunity, or really even community. Really even, a CLT is not limited, to be clear, to just housing opportunities. A CLT can own land and separate title, and a retail establishment can own the improvements on the land. That can drive some revenue, that can help financial sustainability if you think about it, because let's face it, nonprofits don't have a lot of money, and we want to try to figure out how we can stop asking local government for money all the time. So that self-sustainment is an important concept. But stewardship essentially is managing the housing so that it's permanently preserved for its purpose. That's the primary goal of stewardship when we talk about a CLT. It starts with community engagement and education so that people understand, just like this, so that people understand what a CLT isn't and what it is, so that we don't talk about it in ways that are just simply inaccurate, which, by the way, I hear quite often. And that's okay, because that means I have a lot of work to do.
Job security.
Right on. Now, when we talk about community engagement, if you think about the concept of a community land trust and all the things that we can do as a community development tool, not just an affordable housing tool, but community development, the mechanisms that are in place can help combat the impacts of gentrification, particularly displacement. So of course, a lot of times community land trusts are serving, just like affordable housing programs are serving first-time home buyers. And oftentimes, if you haven't owned a house before, you have no idea what the maintenance man at the rental joint is doing on a day-to-day basis, but you sure find out in year one, don't you?
Yeah.
So part of the CLT's relationship with that homeowner is coming alongside them to ensure that they can understand not just after something happens, but before, so that they can take care of their own property. This is not just about creating units, but also building responsible homeowners too. The same we can say about financial planning, talking about the savings that we discussed before, and putting money away so that if they choose, they can move up to purchase in fee simple and continue to build wealth. Because wealth building just doesn't stop with the one house that you buy. So for some folks, you might live in it your entire life, but for many folks, we're moving after 7 years of ownership. That's the American way. That's what the average is. As we talked about ad nauseum earlier, ensuring that the subsidy is retained and ensuring that the home is going to be sold at the price that's established through the resale formula to an income eligible buyer is one of the most critical homeownership activities that a CLT has. And lastly, for this slide anyway, is acting as a contingency to ensure that the unit stays within the affordable housing stock, even in significant negative circumstances where the homeowner may not be able to pay their bills. We don't want it to get lost into foreclosure because these restrictions don't exist when it goes through that process, but by the way that the financial institutions require it to be. Now, that doesn't mean that's a bad thing, it just means the CLT needs to have money readily available to purchase the homes at the price that they're able to purchase the home at, so that it can go to another income eligible buyer rather than going to the speculative market. So continuing a little bit on who this concept really serves. We talked a lot about the financial strength, housing stability, but also talking about the home ownership rate for African Americans in this country. The third bullet, the third black bullet. The rate of CLT home ownership is twice as much for African Americans as compared to fee simple. This is an effective equity tool, and I know that hopefully somebody's recording, and I might get in trouble for saying equity, but it's more about helping folks in our community, because if we don't like people sitting at the bus stop for too long, we got to give them somewhere to go. And not by necessarily giving them a handout, but an opportunity. This also can be said as far as CLT homeowners. They are single-headed households, female-headed households, folks who would otherwise not be able to afford a home in fee simple, typically. So again, CLTs for homeownership provide opportunities where they didn't previously exist. So simply put, the CLT, in summary, before we move to the next phase and maybe have some questions, if you've been holding some, is a best practice approach for implementing shared equity and the concepts of permanent affordability. And these are all the reasons why, but I won't say them again. Is there any questions though, while we pause? Yes, ma'am.
For the resale part, can you explain again the 25% of appreciation, what that means?
Sure. So in the ground lease, there is what is known as a resale formula, and it specifies what amount of the appreciation, if this type of appraisal-based model is used, where we establish how much the home was worth when it was purchased by this person or persons, and then when they sell, another appraisal is done. And so the difference between the two, of course, if it's positive, is the appreciation, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so that 25% is established in the ground lease. It's just an example. It may or may not be 25%. It could be higher, it could be less. But 25% is the average when this type of formula is used. So 25% of the entire appreciation will be able to be realized by the seller.
Okay.
The rest
Okay.
of that, the 75%, is going to remain in the home so it stays affordable to the next buyer. It is not a liquid infusion to the CLT.
Uh-huh.
That is not the intent of the model.
Okay, thank you.
Answer your question, very good.
Good question.
All right, so we'll talk. We started off this conversation talking about some specific parcels that the HFA has title to. So the next few slides are going to talk about some options that the HFA could follow to implement them in a way that you might choose. The options are going to be generic. We talk about the HFA owning the land as well as improvements that may be on that land, maybe serving as its own developer and continuing to own those units, maybe rent them out. Of course, if the HFA is going to continue to own them, we'll be renting them out. That means, of course, that the HFA or some mechanism will have to be created to do things like property management, steward the land, those kinds of things. So essentially creating a CLT-like program, it actually would be more like a rental complex type of approach.
So we have a nonprofit in St. Johns County called the St. Johns Highway Partnership, where Bill Lazar and his group do actually provide that service. I don't know that we as an HFA have enough resources to handle that internally.
That's a great point, because that's the next set of information there at the bottom. So you could continue to own the land as the HFA, but then lease it to a nonprofit organization to provide those services as you mentioned. This type of approach is what the Pinellas County Housing Finance Authority model follows. However, they do have a dedicated source of funding to purchase, to acquire land in its infrastructure surtax, also known as penny for Pinellas. Okay, they're on phase 4. They have quite a large portfolio of units. Most of them are rental units, and using this concept where owning the land and they ground lease it to a developer who produces units and then takes care of the management, and the HFA collects a fee and ensures that those units are made available to folks at an affordable rate based on the provisions that are in the ground lease. I did it again. So everything I said already is there on the slide. That's pretty efficient. Can you pat me on the back?
You earned it. Would you, by chance, be willing to share the PowerPoint so we can send it to the members that didn't make it today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the penny for Pinellas model we talked about just here, about the rental approach, but talking about the home ownership approach, where the HFA does own the land and they enter into a master lease with their local habitat for humanity, who turns around and subleases to individual homeowners, of course, after they put some units together. This concept is somewhat problematic, but hopefully is part of this legislative session. There is some proposals that I've seen here this week, so they're very fresh, that may allow for ownership by a housing finance authority, so that the land isn't taxed, similar to how if a local government owns the land, so long as it's used for affordable housing purposes.
Do you have to know who the sponsors are of that?
No,
You said it was fine?
I can get it for you.
I can look it up if it's fine.
Yeah, it got, matter of fact, I'll get with you after, because our chief policy and legal officer did a whole summary breakdown that I think will get you right on target. Hopefully, I said everything that is true, just that.
I'm just thinking we want to make sure Mark Henderson knows about that.
That's actually, that was Alpha had part in working that for him. So the this approach that Penny for Pinellas or Pinellas County HFA is using does not include subsidy, retention, and resale is at the market price. So just understand that this example is not shared equity in its truest form, but with some tweaks, it could be. So it is something that the Housing Finance Authority here in St. Johns County could certainly pursue to help establish a permanent stock of affordable housing. So an additional option that we are, of course, this whole presentation is leaning towards is the HFA not being the owner of the land, but conveying the land to a community land trust so that it can produce a CLT home ownership opportunity, which would bring all the benefits that we've talked about here today, but more specifically, a ground lease, a tax exemption, and a reduced tax assessment based on the resale value of the home rather than whatever the market, whatever the just value is, whatever the property appraiser says that it is, based on the more typical approach that they would use. This, of course, also means that you're supporting the building of community and supporting a particular operation to be very focused on the things that are most important to assuring that homes are going to remain affordable, i.e. the stewardship we talked about.
Can I ask just your opinion on, when we say convey, can we convey at a price? Or it only works if we donate the land?
It works best when you donate it, because what all that will happen is you're going to take resources from the CLT that would otherwise be necessary for development, for operational overhead, or something else. Especially when you're working with a CLT that is not firmly well-established and has financial sustainability. Eventually, could you charge? Maybe, as long as they have the resources to support it. But permanent affordability will, of course, work best when there's the least amount of cost in the deal and there's the most amount of subsidy within reason. I'm not telling you to over-subsidize something, but within reason. Because if they have to pay for it, they'll probably come back and ask you, can I have some help with building this unit, right? So, any other questions before we move on to specific examples? Very good. We'll talk about some of the more long-standing community land trusts and what the focus is on how or who supported the establishment, not necessarily their productivity since. The Palm Beach County, the CLT of Palm Beach County, later adding on and Treasure Cove